Happy Sunday. It is November 5th, 2023. We've just done a time change. So everyone has had an extra hour of sleep. We're all rested. Even if we weren't rested, we just had that extra hour. So at least we're going to be thankful for the extra hour. We want to introduce our speaker today for Clearwater Baha'is. Our speaker today, her name is Dr. Susan Manick. And the topic that will be discussed today is Tahirih, a religious paradigm of womanhood. Now, it's amazing because in the part of the world where it was considered the darkest place at the time, and to some people it still may be called that, we had the first real act of not just equality, but standing up for oppressed people that had no one to stand up. And it was a person of those people rather than an ally. The person standing up, a woman standing up in a very prejudiced land in the Middle East that wouldn't have allowed that to occur. Miraculously, somehow it happened. And we have this amazing woman named Tahirih, which means the pure one. Now, Dr. Susan Manick is an accomplished associate professor whose academic journey is marked by a profound dedication to the exploration of diverse religious and historical themes. Holding a PhD in history from the University of Arizona, along with an MA in Oriental Studies from the same institution, that is, and an AB in religious studies from the University of California at Santa Cruz. Her educational background reflects a deep commitment to interdisciplinary scholarship. Dr. Manick's research interests are multifaceted, encompassing the intricate intersection of woman and religion, the rich tapestry of Zoroastrianism, the global implications of the Baha'i faith, as well as the historical complexities of the Middle East and South Asian history. Now, her pedagogical expertise extends across various courses, including modern Middle East history, South Asian history, history of civilization, and the Renaissance and Reformation. Dr. Manick's dynamic approach to teaching and research is further enhanced by her active involvement in professional organizations, notably the American Academy of Religion and the Middle East Studies Association. In her continuous pursuit of academic excellence, Dr. Susan Manick has made significant contributions to the field through her recent publications, with upcoming articles in the Encyclopedia of Women and Religion. These articles, quote, Tahirih, the Divine Feminine in the Baha'i Faith, end quote, and, quote, Women in Baha'i Scriptures, end quote, are emblematic of her commitment to shining light on underrepresented aspects of religion and history, enriching our understanding of the diverse human experience. For inquiries and academic engagement, Dr. Manick can be reached at susan.s.manick@jsums.edu. So that is Susan, SUSAN.S.MANECK at jsums.edu. Of course, you can contact her by phone, but you'll have to just go to clearwaterbaha'is.org for her bio to find that phone number. And with that being said, Dr. Manick, we thank you for joining us. Tahirih is such an influential figure in world history, in religious history, and it's amazing because you have had, if I believe you may even allude to this or even discuss it, they even had the play about the story of Tahirih in Russia, right? Back 100 years ago.
Well, thank you, John. I have to say, I am now retired. I came back to California during the pandemic to take care of my elderly mother, who's now 91 years old. So I was online like all of us were for a year, and then they wanted me to come back to campus, and I decided, no, I'd better not at this point. Um, Actually, the articles you mentioned, I think, are already in print. Um, the, my most recent work is actually cast amongst the Parsis of India. So, but in any case, um, so you'll have to excuse both Tony and I are in California, so it's a good thing it was uh, daylight savings, at the end of daylight savings time, because it would have been really early for us. It's 8 o'clock where I'm at right now. But in any case, my work is sort of based on an article I wrote years ago while I was still a graduate student at the University of Arizona. And we won't talk about how many years ago that was. But since then, there have been new developments. Okay. Um, Tony, for instance, along with Dr. Amin Banani, has published a book of Tahirih's poetry, and the poetry I had was my own struggle with some of it. I didn't even try to struggle with her theological works; they were just too dense for me, and I'm afraid my Arabic and Persian, and most of her theological works are in Arabic, have not improved well enough to even deal with that. In fact, I don't know anyone who has been able to deal with her theological writings. They're very, very dense.
I have a
But
question
there,
for those who are interested. Adam's Wish is poems only, right?
I believe so. And yeah, there's been more than one translator to her poetry now. Uh, Before I started, I guess, messing around with it, I think the only translations had been done by E.G. Brown.
And just for the
And
audience's edification, the difference between stuff like Adam's Witch, which we can buy online, we're talking like the poetry of Tahirih. The difference between that and what you just referenced, her theological works, are that she wrote entirely on theology. It wasn't poetry. There's actual treatises and stuff like that, right?
yes, and it's very, very complicated and dense. And like I said, I couldn't make heads or tails of it, so I gave up on it. And really, though, what's more revolutionary than her theology, though, is really her poetry. That's where you get some of the anti-clericalism and whatnot, whereas the other kinds of works are much more traditional. But anyhow, so I wrote this article so many years ago. Since then, um, and I based much of my research on a compilation of sources on Tahirih in Persian by Nogobai. And so I struggled through that. I also used some material from Abbas Amanat's dissertation at the time. Later on, that got published in Resurrection and Renewal. But I used his dissertation, and when I went to publication, then I had to switch it all and find out where it was at in his book. But since then, I think the most important contribution has been made by Dr. Mujan Momin, who has found out more information about Tahirih's family, which I'll get to. And I think this is some of the most striking new material that we have. In any case, I titled my presentation Tahirih, a Religious Paradigm of Womanhood, because it seems to me that every historically minded religion really sort of begins as a reform movement whose intent is to change the very fabric of society. And so it begins with a vision and an ideal. And ideals are something that we have to set before us. There's something that we're supposed to strive towards. And so it's important, I think, that as ideals are approached, that they continue to recede and change, to give us scope for future advances. And once we surpass them, the ideal ceases to be an ideal. And if we cleave to it at that point, it becomes more of a convention that stifles and impedes progress. But in any case, I think every religion has had some paradigm of womanhood. But most of them, if we think about it, have kind of presented women as almost adjunct figures. You might say, for instance, in Hinduism, you have Sita, who is the wife of Ram and the perfect model of what a wife should be, faithful to her husband at all costs. Okay. In Christianity, of course, we have the Virgin Mary, who's a symbol of motherhood, utterly devoted to her son, but remains discreetly aloof from his ministry, at least in the gospel things. I think in some of the church histories, she plays a larger role after Jesus's passing, but that's non-canonical material. We have Fatima in Shiite Islam, who's the daughter of Muhammad and the wife of the Imam Ali. And so she actually is both a mother, a wife, and a daughter together as a model. But Tahirih's really quite different from this. Far from being a dutiful daughter, she's challenging her father's theological positions in many respects. Far from being well, we wouldn't exactly admire her as a wife either, given that she divorced her husband, something unheard of typically in Shiite Islam, or even as a mother, because once she sort of separates from her husband, she leaves the sons with him. Now, I found out subsequently after I wrote this article that the daughter does remain with Tahirih and often and then accompanies Tahirih. But I didn't know that at the time that I wrote this article. But in any case, the boys stayed with their father. Now, given all that, there's little wonder that for Muslims, she's actually a paradigm as well, not just for Baha'is, but for Muslims, she's the paradigms of the dangers of allowing women too much freedom. And I can give you some examples of that from some Muslim sources, which I found. So I want to sort of present to us the significance of Tahirih as a historical and literary figure and as a symbol of womanhood, okay? Now, Tahirih, of course, was born into a very prominent family of ulama of Qazvin. Her father was Mullah Muhammad Saleh, and her uncle was Mullah Muhammad Taqi, and they were probably the most dominant clerics who lived in that city, and there were about 100 clerics there altogether. Her father, Mullah Muhammad Saleh, was renowned for his commentaries on the Quran, tafsirs as they're called. And Muhammad Taqi had probably distinguished himself mostly by his denunciation of his rivals, most especially the Sheikhi school, which he considered to be a dangerous heresy, and had in fact pronounced an excommunication, a takfir against Sayyid Kazim. Now, here's where we come to the changes of the information which I had previously. I had assumed, just like Martha Root does in her own book, that Tahirih learned everything from her father and her uncle. But it turns out the shaky side of the family was her mother's side. And her mother was a mujtahid. Yes, women could be mujtahids. Contrary to a lot of the myths that Baha'is have had, where sometimes we said, well, they weren't even sure women had souls. Of course they didn't. They knew women had souls. But in any case, yes, a woman could be a mujtahid. In fact, at the time of the revolution, in 1979, there was even a female ayatollah. So now a man could not follow a female ayatollah, but she could reach that level of learning and be given an ijazah, a diploma or a permission to interpret Islamic law for herself and perhaps for other women. And Tahirih's mother was one of these mujtahids, and she was a sheikhi. So that's really where the sheikhi half comes. Although I think there was a younger brother who, even on the, Muhammad Saleh side of the family. Now, where did we get this information from? Well, as I kind of hinted before, Mujan Momin discovered it in an encyclopedia article of a Shiite encyclopedia, which was about the family of well, let me put it this way. It was the family of Muhammad Saleh and Muhammad Taqi. And the author of the article turned out to be, his surname was Saleh Shahid. Now, Saleh, that is, remember, Tahirih's father's name. Shahid is what they would call Muhammad Taqi, Tahirih's uncle, after he was assassinated. The Shiites refer to him as the third martyr. Okay, and Shahid means martyr. So who would have a name Saleh from the father and Shahid from the uncle? Nobody but a descendant of Tahirih herself. And so presumably this article was actually written by that. And he gives the whole chronology and the background of Tahirih's mother, which I think is extremely important in terms of understanding that women had their own networks, and that learning was often could be also passed down through the female line. That often gets written out, even of Baha'i histories, because, well, males have done too much of the writing, and they didn't have access to those networks. But that's one thing that the story of Tahirih actually gives us access to, is more knowledge about some of these networks and their importance, and how learning and knowledge and ideas were passed often through this female line in a society where males and females were kept largely separate from one another. And I think Tony can probably tell you that there's a long history of that in terms of the Jewish conversions to the Baha'i faith, and how that was often passed down through the female lines. But in any case, when Tahirih was 13, she ends up being married to Muhammad Taqi's son. Okay, so she's very young when she gets married. The eldest, and that's the eldest son of Mullah Muhammad Taqi, and she bore him 3 children, 2 sons and a daughter. Okay, and soon afterwards, though, there comes to be a lot of family tensions because of Tahirih's following interpretation of Shiite Islam, which her uncle, like I said, who's now her father-in-law, is so stringently opposed to. And she corresponded with Sayyid Kazim, mostly through her Shaikhi relatives. And Sayyid Kazim, in turn, was very delighted to have somebody who was as learned as she was, kind of in his court, if you would. And it's actually Sayyid Kazim who bestows upon her the title of Qurrat al-Ain. Now, Tahirih's actual name was Fatima Zareen Taj Baragani. And Baragani is actually the whole family's name of both Muhammad Taqi and Muhammad Saleh. Okay, the uncle and the brother. That's the larger family. It's presumably that's the place they're from. That's normally what gets used in pre-modern times in Iran for people's surnames. In any case, in kind of this situation, her relationship with her husband very quickly begins to deteriorate. And when her uncle then and father-in-law begins to publicly denounce the Sheikhis, she decides to leave her husband and her sons. She wouldn't have had any choice on that. Generally, it is in Muslim countries, it is the man who has first priority, or first, tends to get custody. Although that can change when it comes to a female, as it did for Tahirih. So she was able to bring her daughter with her, but not the sons. In any case, immediately, though, she returns to her father's house, and only after that does she set out for Karbala, which is where Sayyid Kazim was working. Now, Karbala is the primary pilgrimage site for Shiite Muslims. This is where the Imam Hussein tomb is to be found. And a lot of Shiites want to bury themselves as close to that tomb as possible. They go on pilgrimage there. They, perform all kinds of ceremonies associated with the Imam Hussein's martyrdom, and so it is a site that we often find prominent Shiite clerics at. It also, of course, it was located in Iraq, which at the time would have been part of the Ottoman Empire. That kind of prevented them from being right under the thumb of the Shah. So they could have much more independence from the government there than they might otherwise have. In any case, unfortunately, though, when Tahirih arrives in Karbala, Sayyid Kazim has already passed away, only a few days earlier. And immediately the Shaikhi community was thrown into chaos, I guess you could say, and controversy. There were those who stressed kind of the charismatic and mystical aspects of Shaikhism, but also were the ones who were expecting the imminent return of the 12th Imam, the Mahdi, the rightly guided one who will fill the world with righteousness after it has been filled with iniquity. And which, of course, for the Baha'is would be the Bab. But, and so that is going to be the wing that's going to go looking for the Bab. And then there were a more conservative wing that I guess wanted to sort of, keep things a little bit calmer, build bridges maybe with the Asule ulama, the more traditional ulama. In any case, but Tahirih had pretty much allied herself, as you can imagine, with that more radical wing. and did so by allying herself with Sayyid Kazim's widow, much to the consternation of Sayyid Kazim's son, who really sort of expected to have leadership of the community. In fact, I think it's probably fair to say that Tahirih moves into the house of Sayyid Kazim and virtually takes over the leadership of the Sheikhi community. This is not something that I think has come out normally in Baha'i histories about this. And a lot of the things that we associate with Badasht and with some of the radical things that Tahirih does there, she actually does a lot earlier in Karbala. For instance, unveiling herself. Okay, and we'll talk about how she does it and how it was even more radical as far as Shiites were concerned than what happens at Badasht. By the way, the son's name was Mullah Ahmad, but he does not, he never becomes a Babi. But anyhow, when Tahirih, of course, as we all know, immediately accepted his claim, not on the basis of any evidence or correspondence. She actually corresponds to the Bab before she actually met him, and apparently did so as a result of a vision. And of course, as we know, the Bab had her appointed as one of his chief disciples, the Letters of the Living, and she's the only one that never actually met the Bab. But in any case, the examples of her work, those are the theological ones, are commentaries on the Quran, hadiths, commentaries and whatnot. But one of the themes that does come through is her belief in God's continuing revelation in history. And of course, that's a significant difference, since most Muslims believe that revelation ends with Muhammad. And she also makes the claim, even in Karbala, that Islamic law is no longer binding on Babis. And she stops performing the Muslim obligatory prayers. And probably, like I said, she would appear unveiled at gatherings of believers. Probably the most radical thing was, though, right around Muharram. Now, Muharram is the Shiite equivalent of Holy Week in Christianity. In Christianity, there's 1 week where you have the events leading to Jesus' crucifixion and his subsequent resurrection. Well, the month of Muharram, the first 10 days, commemorate the martyrdom of the Imam Hussein. And Shiite Muslims go through pretty radical means of commemorating it. For instance, men will have processions where they'll whip themselves bloody, literally. In Iran, they actually have passion plays where they'll reenact the story of the martyrdom of the Imam Hussein. Women will often have preachers who will come and preach to them about the sufferings of the Imam Husseins, and they'll beat their breasts, etc. Well, what Tahirih, Muharram also corresponds to the birthday of the Bab. Birthday of Baha'u'llah, too, for that matter. So Tahirih's idea was rather than commemorate Muharram, and remember, this is in Karbala. Okay, this is in Karbala itself, where the shrine of the Imam Hussein himself is. She decides to dress in party clothes and appear unveiled, wearing colorful clothing, and celebrating the birthday of the Bob. As you can imagine, a riot broke out. And eventually, a lot of people ended up getting arrested, but Tahirih among them. Yeah. Okay. Now, in terms of what's that meaning of that unveiling, okay, that's probably the first time that a circle of women had gathered around that appeared to have sort of formulated notions of, maybe awareness of their own deprivations as women, although Tahirih never really addresses the issue of women. I've since found out that the Bob had actually a little more to say about that than I realized when I originally wrote my article, but we had less of the Bob's writings available at the time. In any case, but still, for Tahirih, the Bob's revelation was liberating. And a lot of people, though, certainly saw her as being immodest, even a lot of the Bobbies, and they complained to the Bob, and that's how she got the name Tahirih, the pure one, because basically the Bob reinforced her actions. But in any case, after that, she ends up being arrested. Basically, a mob attacks Sayyid Kazim's home, and the governor of Karbala has to intervene, and he places Tahirih under house arrest. Now, mind you, the governor of Karbala probably was a Sunni Muslim, not a Shiite himself. Eventually, I guess he keeps her for about 3 months, and then he has her sent to Baghdad. And but many of the leading Baha'i women, along with some of the sheikhs, actually followed her there. And she continued her activities. She gave public lectures. Now, I don't imagine that she's always appearing without her veil. No, she only would do that on occasion when she wanted to make a point. She didn't routinely go on. So when she would lecture, she would typically lecture behind a curtain and whatnot. In any case, but she was actually kept, technically she was under arrest. She was being kept at the home of the Mufti of Baghdad. And a Mufti would be sort of I guess you could say the Sunni equivalent of a mujtahid, although that's not precise. But in terms of their rank, maybe the equivalent, you might say. So anyhow, he would have been the highest cleric in Baghdad at the time. But she's, gets into debates with the ulama there. And on one of the occasions, the Shah's Jewish physician attended. Very common for Jews to be physicians in Iran at that time. Okay. Some stereotypes never die or go back very, very far. In any case, he heard her, and he actually becomes the first Jewish Babi. And but what's kind of that was Hakim Masih. And I believe the family subsequently becomes Baha'i. But in any case, the Mufti of Baghdad, his name was Ibn al-Lusi, actually wrote his own observations of Tahirih. And this is taken from Abbas Amanat's work. Some people allege that Qurratul Ayn believes in the total abolition of the duties, but I do not see any truth in this, although she stayed at my house about 2 months, and so many discussions took place between me and her in which there was no taqiyat, meaning dissimulation. In other words, he didn't think she was hiding anything from him. Verily, I saw in her such a degree of merit and accomplishment as I rarely saw in men. She was a wise and decent woman who was unique in virtue and chastity. I have referred to my discussions with her on another occasion. If one became aware of them, one would realize that there's no doubt about her knowledge. It became obvious to me that Babia and Koratia are the same. Apparently, there was some question of that at the time. That's how popular Tahirih had become, that there could be some confusion. They believe that the time for the 5 times obligatory prayers is over and that revelation is unsuspended, and therefore the perfect man, that's Isani Gamal, very old Persian idea, will have further revelations. However, these revelations are not canonical. Well, that's probably the spin he put on it. It would be my guess. In any case, Tahirih never gets tried for apostasy there. And by the way, the penalty for apostasy, at least for men, is death in Islam. But generally, that's not applied to women. So it doesn't happen. But her family in Kazvin is getting rather upset by the stories that are coming back, and in particularly about her unveiling, which is, causing rumors of immorality and whatnot. So Tahirih's father dispatched a relative to Iraq to persuade the governor to order her deportation to Iran. And when she traveled, though, even more excitement is raised up. There's one in one village of Karan, for instance, 1,200 people gave allegiance to her. You can see why there was confusion about between Tahirih and the Bab in terms of who's the leader here. And in Kermanshah, her activities caused such an uproar that the Babis were attacked by a mob and driven out of the city. But not before Tahirih had been able to expand her teachings to the leading women of Kermanshah. And among them were the governor's wife, who, I have to say, a lot of these were already sheikhs at the time. In Hamadan, Tahirih met with the leading ulama and the notable women of the city, and in some cases, apparently even with members of the royal family. Female members of the royal family, I should add. Okay. Now, when she gets to Kazvin, her husband tries to get her to return to his household, get her under control. And that's where we have the famous passage from the Dawnbreakers, where she basically pronounces divorce against him. And she says, if your desire had really been to be my faithful mate and companion, you would have hastened to meet me in Karbala and would, on foot, have guided my hoda. That's kind of a tent you put on top of a camel so that a woman can remain veiled, I guess you could say, all the way to Kazvin. And I would, while journeying with you, have aroused you from your sleep of heedlessness and would have shown you the way of truth. But this is not to be. 3 years have elapsed since our separation. Neither in this world nor in the next can I ever be associated with you. I have cast you out of my life forever. Okay, that makes it pretty clear. But it was something really, really unheard of at the time. It just wasn't done. Normally, it's not that a woman can't get a divorce at all, but what she has to normally do is get her family to support her and to do this on her behalf. And usually has to be matters of abuse and all kinds of other things. But no, you're not my follower. goodbye. In any case, now, Muhammad Taqi, by this time, as one can imagine, is opposed to both the Babis and the Baha'is and the Sheikh. And there's not Baha'is, excuse me, the Sheikhis. And he incited mob violence against them. And after one of these instances, Mullah Abdullah, who was a Sheikhi and a Babi sympathizer, I'm not sure at what point he becomes a Babi, but he's presented as a Sheikhi at this point. Later on, he will die at Fort Tabashi. But anyhow, he decided to retaliate. And when Muhammad Taqi went to the local mosque to offer his dawn prayers, he stabbed him to death. And this led to the arrest and the torture of many of the Babis of Kasvin, and Tahirih herself was implicated. Partly because, if you recall, she kind of has this image that when, she has a confrontation with her uncle, and her uncle slaps her. And she says, Muhammad Taqi, I see your mouth filled with blood. So when he's subsequently assassinated, Tahirih is obviously blamed for it. In any case, because of this, Mullah Abdullah decides to go ahead and turn himself in and said, look, I did it. These people have nothing to do with it, but it doesn't actually lead to the Babis being released. And many of them were executed. Tahirih herself will escape with the assistance of Baha'u'llah, and she will from then on, not from then on, but end up taking up residence in Baha'u'llah's own home. Okay. And Abdul Baha mentions this period in Memoirs to the Faithful, that he's basically sitting on Tahirih's lap as a little boy, because remember, Abdul Baha is born in 1844. And this would have been, well, it's just before Badasht. So 1848? Anyhow, he would have been a preschooler at the time. And anyhow, she says, when word of this spread throughout Tehran, the government hunted for her high and low, and the friends kept arriving to see her in a steady stream. And Tahirih would be seated behind a curtain and would converse with them. And one day, the great Sayyid Yahya Vahid was present here. And as he sat without, Tahirih listened to him from behind a veil. And I was then a child and was sitting on her lap. And with eloquence and fervor, Vahid was discoursing on the signs and verses that bore witness to the advent of the new manifestation. And she suddenly interrupted him, raising her voice, vehemently declared, "O Yahya, let deeds, not words, testify to thy faith. If thou art a man of true learning, cease idly repeating the traditions of the past, for the day of service, of steadfast action is come. Now is the time to show forth the true signs of God, to render veils of idle fancies, to pronounce the word of God, and to sacrifice ourselves in his path. Let deeds, not words, be our adorning." This is to Vahid, right? One of the very primary Babi history heroes. Okay. Now, you may remember that around this time the Bab is arrested, and the leading Babis meet in Badasht to decide what to do about this. And originally it was whether they were going to try to, spring him, I guess you could say. But also they have a few theological issues to work out, which is namely, what is the Bab's purpose? Because just being the 12th Imam or the Mahdi, and originally the term Bab simply meant the gate to the Imam or the Mahdi. You know, um, the notion we have today was not perhaps shared by all of the Bobbies of the time of the Bob's station. So anyhow, so Tahirih and Baha'u'llah end up traveling together to Badasht. And we have 81 Bobbies altogether there. And the tension developed between Tahirih, who once again is on the radical side, just like she was in Karbala, advocating a complete break with Islam, as well as a rather militant defense of their community, and the more conservative Qudus. And keep in mind that Qudus was considered to be the preeminent Babi. And he favored policies at the time that seemed aimed at rejuvenating Islam and making accommodations with religious and secular powers. Okay. And Tahirih is reported to said in his regard, "I deem him a pupil which the Bab has sent me to edify and instruct." Yeah, he's the head of the Babis, you know, after the Bab himself. "I regard him in no other light." Qudus denounced Tahirih as the author of heresy. That's how tense it gets at Badasht. Okay. And at one point, when Qudus was wrapped in his devotions and saying his prayers, probably Muslim obligatory prayers would be my guess. But anyhow, Tahirih rushes out of her tent, brandishing a sword, and says, "Now is not the time for prayers and prostrations, rather onto the field of love and sacrifice." In other words, pretty much the same thing she told Vahid, only now she's doing it with a sword in her hand. Now, as you know, Baha'i history say that Baha'u'llah basically worked it out between the two of them, and that perhaps some of the tension was planned ahead of time. But in any case, Shoghi Effendi describes that scene. He says, Tahirih, regarded as that fair and spotless emblem of chastity and the incarnation of the Holy Fatima, appeared suddenly unadorned yet unveiled before the assembled companions, seated herself on the right hand of the affrighted and infuriated Qudus, and tearing through her fiery words the veils guarding the sanctity of the ordinances of Islam, sounded the clarion call and proclaimed the inauguration of a new dispensation. The effect was electric and instantaneous. She, of such stainless purity, so reverenced that even to gaze at her shadow was deemed an improper act, appeared for a moment in the eyes of her scandalized beholders to have defamed herself, shamed the faith she espoused, and sullied the immortal countenance she symbolized. Fear. Oh, excuse me. Sorry, that's the helper. I'm on Zoom. I'm on Zoom. Okay, thanks. Sorry about that. Okay.
Quick question for you though, like in the context of what you were describing with Tahirih, it seems that she was very much a person in the context of how she would present the teachings or her points. She would have to have a standoff with the people who wouldn't want to listen to her.
Yes, and she was quite prepared to do that in sort of the most radical fashion possible. In any case, fear, anger, bewilderment swept their inmost souls and stunned their faculties. Abdul Khalik Isfahani, aghast and deranged at such a sight, cut his throat with his own hand. He didn't kill himself, by the way. Spattered with blood and frantic with excitement, he fled away from her face. That's how shocking they found this. But like I said, she'd already done this in Karbala. So this was nothing new. But in any case, Tahirih then declares, I am the word which the Qaim is to utter, the word which shall put to flight the chiefs and nobles of the earth. And eventually she does win Qudus over to her side so much that they end up leaving Badasht in the same Hoda. Okay, remember that's kind of the tent, and you mostly use it to keep women private, and you got a man in there. Okay. And not only that, but they're like sitting side by side, reciting poetry. And guess what? That leads to a mob attacking them. And in fact, some people end up dying in the clash. And the Babis end up dispersing in various directions. Now, from 1848 to 1850, as most of you know, there are a lot of pitched battles between the Babis and the government forces in Mazandaran and Zanjan and Neiris. Tahirih during that period remains in hiding. Well, there was Terry, what were you?
I was referring to this meeting that you were talking about when she challenged Qudus. Can you hear me? Hello?
Yes.
Well, this is what I just described as the meeting of Badasht. Karbala meeting happens earlier, and that's during the month of Muharram.
Okay, no problem.
That's where she basically puts on party clothes to celebrate the birthday of the Bab instead of the mourning for the martyrdom of the Imam Hussein.
Thank you very much.
Somebody wanted the I'll write her name down a little bit later. That would I'll give you Tahirih's actual name. In any case, so anyhow, so she remains in hiding for about a year. She's moving from village to village. And then around 1849, she's arrested on charges of complicity in the assassination of her uncle. And Shiites still to believe to this day she was responsible for that. So anyhow, they brought her to Tehran, where she was imprisoned in the house of the Kalantar, basically the mayor. And the Kalantar's wife becomes very attached to her. And then you've got all of these women that are flocking to talk to her. Okay. And of course, subsequently, the Bab is executed in Tabriz. And 2 years later, as we know, a small group of Babis attempted to assassinate the Shah. And that leads to a general massacre of Baha'is. And the government at that point decides to execute her. Okay. Now, according to one European observer, she's taken before the Shah. It would have been Shah Nasruddin, and he supposedly proposed marrying Tahirih if she recants her heresy, of course. And that the poem which she wrote was her refusal to that. That's the poem which E.G. Brown translates. And then when she refuses that, she's then interrogated by a couple of senior mujtahids. And Tahirih then dresses in, and by the way, one of Tahirih's poems is kind of the result of that interrogation. And that actually becomes a song which I believe becomes rather popular in Iran. Perhaps not quite understanding the background to it. In any case, so she's taken to a garden, as you know, and strangled. Now, her last words are reported to be, "You can kill me as soon as you like, but you can't stop the emancipation of women." And that's recorded in God Passes By, but I don't know where what the primary source of that is. In any case, well, I see I've already gone an hour on you. So, let's see. Oh, I do want to say one more thing. I'm not going to get into her poetry because we have other books on that, and my own translations were rather primitive compared to what we now have. But I thought I would share with you what one of the Muslim Shiite polemicists wrote about her. And I actually found this text in English in a text that was written in Pakistan. And here's what it has to say. And I think it'll show you sort of where, how they perceive her. It seems God created women as a sort of test for men. It is forbidden to go, as it is forbidden to go near wine, so it is forbidden to go near other women. When beautiful women discard their modesty, they bring rains of devastation. There was such a woman, Qurratul Ain, in Iran. Qurratul Ain was an extraordinarily beautiful woman. She was well educated, and oration was her special art. She could compose poetry in the Persian language. When she came to know that Ali Muhammad Bab had innovated a new religion, she not only accepted the religion, but also became a preacher. To lure people into the fold of her new religion, she renounced purdah, which is seclusion. Purdah actually means the veil in Urdu, and began to mix up with people, showing her beauty and preaching the new religion. She succeeded in gaining a hold over a large number of people on account of her beauty. She was opposed by her family, but she did not yield. She feared her young uncle's wrath, hence she directed her lovers to murder that holy soul. Several of her lovers went in search of her uncle, and they learned that he was in some mosque offering prayer. They went there and murdered the mujtahid in the state of prayer. When her prime opponent was removed, she became bold enough to preach her hedonism with more gusto. Tension prevailed in Iran due to her activities. The Emperor of Iran sent his army to capture her. When the mischievous Qurratul Ain was brought before the royal court, she came barefaced. The king bent his head down, but the others began to look at her marvelous beauty stealthily. In other words, for Muslims, she becomes the ultimate whore, if you would, tempting men in various ways, okay? But notice that even they cannot avoid the fact of her eloquence. And that eloquence is important because it becomes also a model for Baha'i women within Iran. And one of the reasons I would say Tahirih is a paradigm, even though Bahia Khanum in some ways has the highest station, is well, how many women do you know whose name is Tahirih? And yet, you know, in other words, that's kind of a favored Baha'i name to give to girls because that's the model we want them to follow. And eloquence is something that's cultivated within the Baha'i community in Iran, that so much that non-Baha'i anthropologists and whatnot have noticed it. I don't think Diamond Girl is about Tahirih, but I could be wrong. Someone asked. In any case, so in that sense, I think that Tahirih is truly, truly unique to us as Baha'is. Okay, let me see if I can write down Tahirih's name. Just a second here. It's a rather long name, so you'll have to give me a minute here because I want to write it down right and not off the top of my head. And I've messed up all my pages. Wouldn't you know? Okay, let's see. All right, hang on. Actually, I know how to get this quickly. Her first name is Fatima, by the way. But there's also Sarin Taj. I think Sarin Taj was the name of one of the wives or daughters of one of the imams, as I recall. Taj. Here we go. Hang on. I was hoping I could just paste it, but I can't.
Zarin Taj means crown of
Zarin
gold.
Taj bed, crown of gold, yeah.
Yeah.
And Fatima, of course, was, as I mentioned before, Fatima Zaran Taj. And then you'd have her, let me check, see, how do I spell that? That's the family name, is what would, Baragani. Okay, here we go, Baragani. That's the entire family's name. And I expect that was maybe probably the encyclopedia entry, which Mujan probably found, was the family of Baragani. Let's see. All right. Oh, a mujtahid. Okay. A mujtahid means someone who, it comes from the word ijtihad, which means to interpret. And a mujtahid is someone who is qualified in Shiite Islam to interpret Islamic law independently. Okay? When Baha'u'llah forbids interpretation, that's what he's forbidding. Is, you see, every Shiite layman is expected to practice what's called taqlid, which means imitation. Usually in the writings, it gets translated as blind imitation, because a Shiite layman is supposed to pick a mujtahid whose rulings they will follow. And nowadays that would be an Ayatollah. Okay, and nowadays you have, the Grand Ayatollah, Marja Taqlid, the one that all the mujtahids even follow. But that wasn't so much the case back then. And so, and what Baha'u'llah is actually prohibiting is this Taqlid mujtahid relationship, where some people imitate and other people make these authoritative interpretations. And I think it's important to keep that in mind, because when we say, oh, you're interpreting, you can't interpret, like we can't have our own understanding. Of course we can. But, this idea that you can interpret for other people and that other people are expected to follow your interpretation is what's strictly prohibited in the Baha'i faith. Any more questions?
May I ask a
We ended up
question?
with, sure.
Okay, you said, hi, this is Lisa. You mentioned earlier that perhaps not all the Bobbies understood that as they were following the Bob, which means the gate, that they didn't know what that meant. That's it, I'm having a hard time with that and not understanding that. How could they follow someone whose teachings and name was, his whole purpose was to tell of the one foretold by God, and not understood who he was? Could you help with that?
Yeah, the Bob only very gradually reveals his station. Okay? You know, and claiming to be, understand that in Shiite Islam, after Muhammad, you have the 12 Imams. Okay? And the 12th Imam, who probably never existed until until the Bob comes along, was said to have been disappeared in his childhood and would return at the end of the age as the Mahdi. But there's a period of time where some people claim to be gates or abwabs to the hidden Imam. There's a series of 4 of them. Okay, and so it initially appears that the Bob is claiming to be one of these 4, or not necessarily one of these 4s, but a gate to the Imam like the earlier ones. Now, and only very gradually does he reveal himself. Now, it's all kind of in the Qayyum al-Asma, which is what the Bob reveals, when he makes his declaration to Mullah Hussein. But not everybody quite understood that. And it was probably kept kind of deliberately so. And then later on, he makes it clear that he himself is the Imam. And that's where you have, actually, when he's under arrest and he's brought before the tribunal and he says, I am the one whose name you have invoked. Well, that would be the Mahdi himself. But clearly the Bob was more than an Imam too, at least from the Baha'i standpoint. And Tahirih, that also reflects Tahirih's understanding, because otherwise, why would she be talking about the abolishment of Quranic law? Certainly none of the 12 Imams ever did that, or the 11 ones who preceded him. So it's he only very gradually unfolds his mission. And by the way, the same thing's true of Jesus. If you read the Gospels, especially I think it's the Gospel of Matthew, where he only very gradually kind of leads the disciples to an understanding of who he is. And there seems to be almost I guess you could say, a messianic secret initially. And I think the same thing was similar to what we see the Bob doing here, very gradually unfolding his mission. And, the Kitab-i-Ghan was written, as you may know, to one of the Bob's uncles. And he had been a Bobby. It's not the Kitab-i-Ghan that makes him a Bobby, but what didn't make sense for him was, well, if he is the Mahdi, then how did he go out? How could he have gotten killed like this? Because Sunnis often didn't see that would happen, that they thought that the Mahdi would return at the end of time, in some cases along with Jesus Christ, that they would together fight the great battle of Armageddon and defeat the causes. Instead, the Bob goes and gets himself killed. How can that be? And Baha'u'llah's answer is, hey, this has all happened before. And that's why he begins to tell the story of Christ and all the other prophets and how much that they've suffered and whatnot. Now, that wasn't an idea that was totally unknown to Shiites, or they wouldn't have had the emphasis placed on the Imam Hussein. It is rather, though, not something easily accepted by Sunni Muslims. You see, one of the differences between the history of Christianity and the history of Islam is that Islam seems to be very successful right from the start. You know, yes, Muhammad went through some period of persecution, but once he gets to Medina, it seems like victory after victory after victory. And within a generation of the Prophet's passing, they own the whole Middle East. Whereas, Christianity undergoes 3 centuries of persecution before it starts having any political power, if you would. And consequently, a lot of Muslims have this perception that if you're on God's side, you're going to be victorious. Shiites are more likely to recognize that, hey, if you're on God's side, you're likely to be martyred. But even that isn't entirely clear. And consequently, we have Baha'u'llah writing the Kitab-i-Iqan, which demonstrates just how much persecution and whatnot the prophets have gone through. And maybe it isn't, victory to victory. More questions?
Yeah, I can say something. Okay. Thanks so much to Susan, actually. This is quite an important narrative, which is not easy to put together, of Tahirih's life and career. And so that was fantastic. I wanted to point out a couple of things that Susan has already said. One is that many large numbers of Tahirih's followers were women, and her teaching and her power really came from these women's networks. And I recently published an article, which is online, by the way, opening a parenthesis here. Mujan Momen was able to put together an entire issue of the journal Religions, which is an online journal. And there are a number of articles in there. Anyway, one of the articles is by me, and it's about Tahirih and her poetry, where you find out more about her than anything else. Anyway, it's called Babi Theology in Poetry, and it's online somewhere. Anyway, I'm arguing there that her female following, the fact that she was preaching largely to women, really influenced her teachings extraordinarily, to be teachings of peace and love and reconciliation and coming together of nations and so on. And the other Babis were not talking about this. This was not something that you would find in most Babi teaching, including the teachings of the Bab, by the way.
Although there's more of it in the Bab's teachings than I think has often been recognized.
Yeah, you can find it there, but in Tahirih's teachings, it's right there out in front. And I think that has to do with her the fact that it's a feminine message. Anyway, the other thing is Tahirih is important not only in Baha'i history, but in the whole history of Islam, because, she is really extraordinary in the sense that there are all kinds of Muslim reform movements and heresies and hundreds of years of, heterodox movements within Islam and so on. None of them ever abolished the Sharia or moved beyond the orbit of Islam itself. And Tahirih's teachings, she just discards the whole Islamic law, says that's it, it's over, time for a new revelation, and takes off from that point. And that's just, even up to today, there has been no other movement within Islam that has gone that far. Except
well, Akbar did try it with the Din Ilahi. I don't know if you know, Emperor Akbar thought he was the
in India,
too.
sure.
Yeah, but in India, you can do all kinds of things.
Yeah, that was to bring together Muslims and Hindus and others.
Yes.
Really wasn't within Islam, so at least as far as I know.
Well, the Din Ilahi was more of a cult within the court, but it was also Akbar setting himself as the final arbitrary of all religion.
And it was sort of a royal
thing for him to do.
Yeah, it was kind of a royal cult in order to keep things even.
But he doesn't go outside of the court trying to convert people.
No.
In any case,
I mean, it's just extraordinary.
That article, that journal, Religion, and it is online. I think that's a published out of Australia, is it not? If I recall.
Yeah.
I actually reviewed most of the articles in there, and now they will not leave me alone. They keep sending me more and more stuff to review.
Sure. You did it to yourself. So
I did it to myself. But they sent me all this, and what am I going to say? No, I'm not going to review it. So, in any case, it is a very important thing, because this is a very reputable religious studies journal, and they basically devoted an entire issue to us, which was, rather nice. And yeah, you can access it online, so it is nice.
We have a question, I think, hand raised by Diana.
Let me scroll down. Okay.
Yeah. Yes. Thanks. I was wondering. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
If we have any information about Tahirih's children and how did they react to what she did, and also did any of her relatives become Babis and eventually Baha'is? Thank you.
I'm not sure about her daughter, but the sons followed their father in Kazvin. So, and I believe they accepted the belief that she was responsible for her uncle's assassination, and that would have been their grandfather. But I need to go through Mujan's article again. Maybe Tony can say something about it. But before Tony.
Yes, you're quite right. The sons were separated from their mother. They followed their father. They became clerics, Muslim clerics in their own right. And the entire family, I mean, all of her descendants through her sons are a clerical family. They have a kind of ambiguous and contradictory relationship to Tahirih, because they reject her ideas, but they're quite proud of her poetry, and they pass it around secretly, and they're quite proud of her prominence. So it's kind of a schizophrenic attitude towards Tahirih, actually. But they're Muslim clerics. I don't know about the daughter at all.
Yeah. Somebody, Pauline had asked about the relationship between the Greatest Holy Leaf and Tahirih. I don't think there would have been, because Abdul Baha would have only been about 4 years old when he was sitting on Tahirih's lap and recorded that incident between her and Vahid, which, by the way, is rather extraordinary that he would remember it in such detail. But the great Bahia Khanum would have only been about 2. And that would have been expecting a little bit too much for her to have recalled any interaction with her, you know. You know, she was just I believe she was 2 years, 2 years between her and Abdul Baha, as I recall. So that would make her 2.
So we have one last question from Tarane Mohajer, and I think it'll be good for us to close out for today.
Okay.
In one of the conferences I heard, so I want to just verify it with you, that emancipation of women in this country happened, but Badasht event was 2-3 weeks before that. So in a sense, the emancipation with women started with Tahirih before the emancipation of women here.
Well, it's interesting. I think what's being referred to is the conference at Senegal Falls. The women's movement in the U.S. actually grows out of the movement to emancipate the slaves and to enslave the abolitionist movement in the U.S. What happens is women are basically sort of at the forefront at the abolitionist movement. Then when they go to London, where there's a big conference of abolitionists, they're not allowed a seat because they're women. Okay. And then they come back home and they say, hey, who is it that we're trying to liberate? And that leads to the Senegal Falls Conference, which basically, yes, it more or less corresponds with the Conference of Badasht.
Thank you.
There had been a women's movement in...
Lena, you say you have some information about her children?
Yes, I do. Yes. And this information comes to me from Dr. Muhammad Hosseini of Vancouver, BC. And he gave the information is 2015. So that's my source.
Okay, and he's those of you who aren't familiar with him, he's done a lot of scholarship on the Bab. He was a student of
yes. And he has written a book on Tahirih, which has not yet been translated into English. He wrote it in Farsi through the Association of Baha'i Studies. They have the copyright.
Yes, I think all of his work is in Persian, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, yeah. So here's the information if you're interested. She had 2 sons and a daughter, Sheikh Ismail Ibrahim, Sheikh Ibrahim and Sheikh Ismail are the boys, and Zina was the daughter. The sons were very active enemies of the Baha'i faith and frequently spoke against the faith from the pulpit. Zina passed away 6 months after the martyrdom of her mother, and it is said that she died of a broken heart. Sheikh Ismail married a lady by the name of Masume Khanom. They had a son, Ni'matullah Varta. So this was a grandson of Tahirih. This son was a famous poet and scholar, and at his request, he was taught the faith by Mr. Azizullah Misbah and accepted Baha'u'llah.
Wow. I wonder, though, that whether it's his descendant or if it's the descendant of the other son that wrote the article that Mujan did. I guess we'll have to go check a little bit further on that one.
Okay. Keep us posted.
Well,
okay.
Thank you all very much for all these very scintillating comments, questions, and of course, Dr. Manik, thank you so much for joining us, and Anthony Lee, again, thank you for being with us again. Kalamat Press over here, we're very grateful that you're able to come in. For all of you who are interested in buying books, definitely check out various sources. We recommend you to start your journey now. Read a lot of amazing books about Tahirih. They're out on the market. You can go from among the many publishers. Kalimat Press is here in America. You're more than welcome to check it out. Is there a website for Kalimat Press? We could
sure. Kalimatpress.com.
All right, there you
just
go, everyone.
there. Or just say kalimat.com will do it too.
And Dr. Manik, you have some books published there, correct?
Kindle.
Sorry?
I have some articles, not books. The only book I've ever written was on Zoroastrianism, but I have articles in books that are carried by Kalimat. But I think
so
there's
just a clarification, though.
But I think,
just a clarification, though. Zoroastrianism, Baha'is believe that the prophet Zoroaster had a message from God, and it's very fundamental to religious history. Perhaps a lot of people can read that book of Zoroastrianism.
We accept him as a manifestation as well.
Can you please tell us what that book?
Well, it's not on ancient Zoroastrianism. It's more on the modern Parsis of India.
Interesting.
Yeah, and I mean, it's basically, well, not modern, but I guess what happened to Zoroastrianism after the rise of Islam up until the middle of the 19th century, and with more focus on the Parsis of India than anything else. But in any case, it was published by the Parsis themselves, interestingly enough, without my knowledge. But that's another story. The articles that I have on Tahirih, besides being published by the Journal of Baha'i Studies, there's also a version of it that was published. I think was it Oxford University Press? I think. I guess they did my women's.
But
now I'm
the
getting
Journal
all
of Baha'i
messed up.
Studies is available for people to review the articles. Yes.
Yeah, you can find the older the older version of it. And that can be found online. In the now, let's see. Yeah, I think it's see if I can even. Nope, can't do it.
Some basic.
Unfortunately, there are some things my Chromebook doesn't do.
There's some basic books about Tahirih. Martha Root's biography is the first.
Yeah, don't rely on that as
no,
Tony,
of
I'm
course
sure can
not.
tell you.
It was published in 1939, but it's still in print at Kalimat Press. So that's the first biography. There's also the compilation Tahirih in History, which is a compilation of articles, including Susan's, I believe, which is available.
Yes, that one contains mine. And the editor of that one is not a Baha'i, interestingly enough.
Oh, no, he was a Baha'i. He's a Pakistani guy who was a counselor at one point. He's passed away now. And so he was a Baha'i. Yeah, he put together all of these articles from Pakistani sources.
Oh, no, Baha'i. No, but I'm saying the Tahirih in History.
Yeah, Tahirih in History. What's his name? Escapes me. Anyway, he was a Baha'i, I assure you. I corresponded with him and published his book. So, but his family is Baha'i. And then there's also the translation of poetry. There are 2 books by George Ronald, I believe, and 1 by Kalimat Press with Dr. Banani. So there is quite a bit.
We thank all of you for coming here today for the session. It was definitely fruitful. We appreciate, again, the time that Dr. Susan Manik took to discuss the subject of Tahirih and the contribution she made, her life, and of course, addressing some questions that were burning in people's hearts. We thank all of you again for joining. We hope you have a beautiful Sunday. And for all of you who are now watching this on Facebook or on YouTube recordings, please like and subscribe. We look forward to having another video with Dr. Manik on another one of her topics, which she has a few, and we're hopeful and grateful first that Susan came, and of course hopeful for the next session that we have together.
Oh, okay, great.
We hope all of you have a beautiful afternoon.
Glad to be here.
Okay, thanks so much.
Okay.
Thank you.